Hey there, my name's Jordan, and I'm a financial coach and financial planner. And today I'm your host at the Reimagine Wealth podcast, where we share imperfect stories about embodying our values, weaving just system level safety nets, and working to build the world that we want to live in, one where we all get to have our needs met and thrive. Let these be shared learnings that allow you to more deeply explore, experiment, and shift, and that allow us to unlock our collective knowledge. This show is ad-free and available to everyone, and it wouldn't be possible without your love and support. So if you like what you're listening to, please like, review, subscribe, and share the show with those in your community. If you're able, please support my work to produce the show by becoming a paid member of my Substack, which starts at $6 a month. Link to that and more is in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening. And now let's get into the show. Welcome, welcome. I have some wonderful guests from an organization called Critical Resistance. We have Shirley Leslie and Abby Borden here with us today. And we're really going to be exploring more about the abolitionist movement and also doing some visioning about what can an abolitionist future really look like. So I am thrilled to have them here today. And as you might know, Shirley and Abby, I usually start off with money stories. And so just as a way to introduce yourself, I would love to invite you both to share a little bit about your own money story, or just the ways in which that connects to the abolitionist work that you're doing today.
Thanks for this offering, Jordan. I can go ahead and start us off. Yeah, it's funny. I normally don't think about my own mini story, and I would probably need to flesh that out a bunch more in depth. My main political organizing has only ever been in critical resistance, and I jumped headfirst into that work after first volunteering with some jail closure campaigns, specifically into development. And through there, that's where I've really developed more of my politic and an understanding of an orientation to money and resources. So that's the biggest point of frame that I have for a money story. But yeah, did not come from wealth, working class family and background. And just seeing it as a vehicle to support efforts to create the world we want, in one of many very material ways. Yeah, I think that's just a little bit of what's coming up for me.
Yeah, thank you. And just since you touched on it a little bit, anything you want to share about how, like, the politic you were naming and like how you orient to that you want to share with listeners?
Yeah, at Critical Resistance, we understand that unfortunately we still exist under racial capitalism, which means that we still need funding and donations of time, money, effort, to do the work that we need. And we see it as a way of measuring community buy-in. If people really resonate with the work that we're trying to do, and want to support that, again, with their time, effort, or funds, then that is just one way that people can show up to sustain and grow prison industrial complex abolition. And we work to utilize our resources collectively and as effectively as possible. So thinking about what does the moment call for? What do we need? What's the people power we need? What are the tools and materials that we need? And how do we go about making that possible? Yeah.
And thank you for bravely going first. Abby, what about you?
Thanks, Jordan. Thanks, Shirley. And thanks, Jordan, for having us. For me, as Shirley mentioned, we both make up 2/3 of the critical resistance development team. So we do a lot of work to try to build relationships with donors, foundations. We're a majority grassroots funded national organization. So a lot of our day-to-day efforts in the development capacity are building those relationships, stewarding those relationships, helping folks to see the impacts of our work. And as Shirley mentioned, think about different ways that they can donate time, money, effort to be of support. to that work, whether it's in the local context through one of our chapters or in the national context. We have opportunities for folks to donate and get involved in all different kinds of capacities. I came to CR's development team through involvement organizing with the Oakland chapter, which is the longest standing chapter of critical resistance. I've been a member of the chapter for a number of years and have been organizing in different capacities, including what we call our inside-outside work, which is organizing with our comrades inside behind bars, through our mail program, which also engages volunteers in a local context, which is a great way for folks to be able to donate and support in non-financial ways to the organization's work. And when I think about my kind of broader money story, since my work in CR, critical resistance, didn't initially start in a financial organizing kind of capacity, I actually think back to growing up. I'm Bay Area born and raised, shout out. And I grew up in a relatively pretty wealthy area of the Bay Area in the North Bay in Marin County. And I went to very well funded and taken care of public schools for most of my life. And one thing that I remember as an early engagement in fundraising for me was actually through I was in arts programs in high school that were their own private 501c3s, basically, that were operated through the public school. So we did a lot of fundraising to get those programs to keep running. We would have like annual fundraisers that folks would look forward to and that were pretty engaging for our community. So that's something that I think of as an early exposure to my fundraising kind of work and engaging with donors as far as making sure that folks understood, what is this program? What is it offering? How is it impacting our community? And why is it important to me as someone who's involved in it? And I think a lot of that is actually informed how I think of fundraising. When I talk to people about fundraising for CR, including members from our different chapters, they go, oh, maybe I haven't fundraised before. Maybe I don't know how to talk to people about money, or it's uncomfortable to talk to people about money. They, well, it's actually really easy to fundraise for CR if it's work that you believe in. You just talk about the work and why it matters to you. And then you can kind of ask how people are able or interested in getting involved and let the conversation kind of go from there.
Appreciate that introduction. Thank you both. I'm excited to get more into the history of abolition and abolitionist movements, which, has been around for centuries. And I think just one important grounding piece for listeners before I open it up, and so whichever of you would like to answer, it is impossible to separate enslavement and our current day prison industrial complex from financial markets. The wealth that our country was built on, Turtle Island was built on, came directly from enslavement, from collateralizing Black bodies, Indigenous bodies, and displacement. And with Juneteenth having just happened, I think it's extremely important to really center that. White families' wealth was built on enslavement and displacement and genocide. And that's one of the reasons I really want to talk more about abolition on this podcast too. So I really appreciate Shirley and Abby being here today. So whichever one of you feels called to answer, can you just share more about the history of abolition and just the ways in which it's connected, not just to ending the prison industrial complex, but actually to our liberation collectively?
Yeah, great question, and a really important thing to ground in. And I might tap this out, starting with a definition. So just delving into, what are we even talking about when we're mentioning the prison industrial complex, or PIC, as we may call it? The PIC is a term that we use at Critical Resistance to describe the overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. So I know that that's a lot, and there is far more that we could delve into, but won't do that today. We have full 2-hour workshops on that, even that definition. But I wanted to ground us there. There are different types of abolition, and wanted to be clear that we're talking about prison industrial complex, or PIC, abolition. We call it such, of course, very much drawing from the legacy of the abolition of slavery in the 1800s. And I want to note that we have a couple things in mind when we say abolition. One, as abolitionists, we understand that the PIC is not broken. It is not a broken system that needs to be fixed. Rather, it's working precisely as it's designed to contain, control, and kill people representing the greatest threats to state power. So we're really not trying to improve that system in any way, expand or extend that system in any way, but shrink it into non-existence. And so that's just one big thing I wanted to keep in mind. And so if you ever hear us talk about abolitionist reforms as opposed to reformist reforms that may make the system a little nicer, make the cages a little bit nicer, make the cops a little bit nicer, with no.
Like body cams on officers.
Exactly, you understand. So yes, as opposed to those reformist reforms that, again, maintain and even expand that system, we are working to shrink and starve the PIC. Pulling from that legacy of the abolition of slavery, understanding that both systems were created and perfected to maintain racial capitalism and those people that benefits. And so we understand that we need to dismantle that system at large, and also wanting to bring up, again, we tend to look at imprisonment, policing, surveillance, and understanding that even post the nominal abolition of chattel slavery in this country, seeing the emergence of things like the Black Codes, which were crucial to maintaining subjugation of marginalized peoples, particularly Black folks in the U.S. And those were really things meant to contain, harm, disappear, and kill folks that, again, were really great threats to state power. So a couple different points of connecting the abolition of slavery to prison industrial complex abolition that we're talking about now.
One of the main ways that CR sees our role in the movement ecosystem that is building right now towards abolition of the prison industrial complex is, as Shirley mentioned, we have lots of workshops, we have lots of tools, things to try and cohere our abolitionist politic, and really focus on being a source of political education for folks inside the movement, folks who want to come into the movement. So one thing is this fantastic chart that we have that is reformist reforms versus abolitionist steps to abolish policing, like Shirley was mentioning. We have another one that's specifically about abolishing imprisonment as well. Like Shirley said, these are different tools of the same system that are interlocking and that create this prison industrial complex. So named partially because it is complex. It's many interlocking forces. That's something I like to think of that comes from one of our intro workshop series, that it is indeed a complex force that we interact with, all of us, as Shirley mentioned, inside the Imperial Core and outside every day of our lives through surveillance, policing, imprisonment, and other systems that we see interlocking in that way. And one other thing that I wanted to add is just another definition, which is just what we think of, again, as our role as CR in this movement to abolish the prison industrial complex. And we think of ourselves, CR, as building a grassroots movement to challenge the use of punishment to cure, quote unquote, cure complicated social problems. We know that more policing and imprisonment does not make us safer. And instead, we know that things like food, housing, and freedom are what really create healthy, stable neighborhoods and communities. So one of the things that we really aim to do is to disrupt those narratives that we see so often in American political conversations and imperial political conversations across the world, that more safety always equals more police, more money for police. Something that you mentioned too, Jordan, more money for body cameras. That'll keep us safer. More money for more comfortable prisons. That's what'll keep us safer. And we know absolutely not. That's not something that's going to keep us safer. So in our work, what we're really aiming to do is organize to build power and to stop the devastation that the reliance on imprisonment and policing has brought to ourselves, our families, and our communities, really recontextualizing the PIC as something that perpetuates violence instead of disrupting violence.
I want to dig into that just a little bit because narratives of like, oh, well, we need to increase funding for the police or we need to increase funding for incarceration. I mean, what our tax dollars are doing right now. That is such a common like response in the name of public safety. You know, when we're talking about funding and investing in the things that actually do keep us safe, that actually do keep us cared for, obviously that's really addressing the root causes of like having access to housing, food, healthcare, all of the common things that we need to survive. But what would you say if you were talking to somebody? Because literally in Austin, we had a couple instances of gun violence. And so now that's triggering, you know, another debate over like, do we have mass surveillance cameras installed, like ALPRs? Do we, you know, fund the police even more than we already are? So what would your response be if you were talking to someone who was like, I think we do need to fund the police, or I think we do need these body cameras or this mass surveillance software? Yeah, how would you approach like having that conversation? Because I think that's also helpful for listeners who agree and are like in those conversations day to day.
I'll maybe start by sharing something that we often ask people in workshops or community building days, or other spaces, like, what makes you feel safe? And just kind of start from there. And more often than not, the answer never involves cops or cages. It clearly, you know, touches on a lot of the things you named before, like food, housing, freedom. But it can also often touch on things like stable and meaningful employment or just like relationships with my neighbors. If things come up, do I have people to call on? Do I have a network of support that makes it so that like I and we collectively feel capable of dealing with when harm does occur? Community programs often come up, like does my kid have somewhere to hang out after school? Great. Yeah, lots of really sweet, creative, um very collective and community driven responses to that question before we even start talking about like, okay, what do cops and cages do? Like, no, just from a bird's eye view, what do you want? What do you need? What do you feel that your community or even you as an individual just needs to not just get by, but thrive? Yeah, I'll pause there.
That took the words right out of my mouth, Shirley. And I think something that I want to uplift from what Shirley was saying is that abolition of the prison industrial complex does not just include tearing things down, it also includes building things up. We have a three-part theory of change at Critical Resistance that we call DCB for short, or dismantle, change, build. So when we think about those three interlocking and concurrent approaches to prison industrial complex abolition, we think about dismantling the interlocking systems of policing, imprisonment, and surveillance that actively harm our communities. We think about changing common sense around what it is to be safe, how we as our communities welcome safety, how we build safety, how we are safe. And we think about building the infrastructure that actually makes that possible. So for example, we have in the Bay Area, we have a number of non-police emergency phone lines and contacts that are things that have sprung up from community, more so since 2020, since the George Floyd uprisings, and folks really coming together and organizing around the violence that policing causes every day in our communities. And one of the reasons that those phone lines are so important is because of what Shirley was mentioning in things people actually name when they're talking about what makes them feel safe. Who can I call that is not the cops when something is happening? So in our abolitionist communities, folks are building that infrastructure. Who do you go to if you don't want to go to the cops? If you know that the cops arriving isn't going to make you feel safer or is going to endanger other people in your community. So that's one example of abolitionist building that's happening around us today. And there are more phone lines like that in other communities as well. In addition, something that I like to introduce in a conversation with folks who are maybe not as familiar with abolition of the prison industrial complex, or who maybe are starting to, they can recognize like, I don't love having to call the cops, but aren't they supposed to make us safer? Is that the police have never functioned as a body that stops harm. They've always functioned as a body that responds to harm at the very most. So if you think about what blocks in your city, what neighborhoods in your city are the safest, right? If we're talking about safety, are those going to be the ones that have the most cops or the ones that have the least cops? Even though it's only a surface level provocation, is kind of an entry point into that changing of folks' understanding of what it is to be safe, what it is to have safety. I've never seen like a neighborhood that feels totally safe that's crawling with cops. That usually does make things feel a little bit less safe to have people with guns around every corner who have impunity. That's just an entry point for that conversation that I kind of can find can help break that conversation open with folks.
Yeah, no, I so appreciate you both getting into the details on that, because I think those are the real conversations to have to kind of disrupt the narratives that we're socialized into. So thank you both. And we're gonna soon talk about, like using the DCB kind of framework, that abolitionist future that we can live into. But before we move into that, I just want to lift up what major wins or lessons have come out of the abolitionist movement, or just from the chapter work that's happening at Critical Resistance. And I would love to also hear, because like you said, you have a chapter in the Bay Area. I know you also have other chapters throughout the country. So maybe just highlighting some of the wins, victories, lessons that have come out in the last several years of your work.
I can start this one off with giving a little overview of what chapters we have currently in operation, how they're organizing in their communities. We currently have 5 chapters in operation in Critical Resistance. We have Critical Resistance Oakland, which is our longest standing chapter. That was where the organization began in 1998, was in the Oakland chapter. We have our Critical Resistance Los Angeles chapter, Critical Resistance Portland, Oregon, New York City, as well as our most recently opened chapter, taking us to 5, our only regional chapter, Critical Resistance Central Appalachia, with members organizing across Kentucky, West Virginia, which is a really exciting organizing landscape. And they've had a lot of amazing wins just in the last year or so that they've come together as a chapter of Critical Resistance. Right now, one win that I'll start with, because it's super recent and super energizing. We've had a huge win coming out of Critical Resistance New York City that has been working for a number of years, organizing with the Abolish ICE New York, New Jersey coalition around the Dignity Not Detention New York Act, which was passed at the end of May. And Dignity Not Detention is a bill which aims to break all collaboration between local and state facilities with ICE to cage immigrants. So that's a huge win coming out of CR New York City. Again, years of tireless organizing from our folks on the ground there in coalition with lots of other fantastic organizations across New York and New Jersey. So right now, what our members are doing is working to push through the implementation phase of Dignity Not Detention in order to maximize releases of folks as opposed to transfers of folks within the system of immigrant detention, and ensuring that folks who are being transferred and released have material support. We're using some infrastructure that we have for prisoner correspondence to be tracking folks through that really confusing system, to be able to ensure that we're staying in contact with folks, and that we're working to address some of the material needs that come up for folks in a very real way through the system of being detained and experiencing that violence on a day-to-day level. Back on the California side of the map, we've got our Oakland and Los Angeles chapters working together through the Close California Prisons campaign in coalition with Californians United for a Responsible Budget, also known as CURB. We've been working on this campaign for a number of years with the goal of getting 10 prisons named for closure across the state of California. Happy to report that we've had a total of 4 prisons named for closure so far in the scope of this campaign. Most recently with the announcement that CRC Norco in Riverside County will be closed. So that's a huge win. That came about last year. And now what we're working with is a couple of different focuses within that California Prisons campaign. One is to ensure that we can defend our wins by making sure that prisons that have been named for closure, where folks have started to be released or transferred away from those facilities, are not going to be targeted by ICE to be converted into detention centers. Well, there is also a campaign being waged by some of our comrade organizations that I'll uplift here, specifically around defending the closure of the women's federal prison in Dublin, which was closed in the last couple of years in the wake of some really horrendous systemic sexual violence being perpetuated against women incarcerated there by COs, correctional officers. And really, there has been a huge swell of community support to specifically defend that facility from being converted into an ICE detention facility, and instead really asking the question of, what does this community need? What else could we do with this space? What else could we build, right? Getting back to the DCB, to avoid continued investment as a community into the prison industrial complex, and how could we meet the needs that we have here? And in addition to defending our wins in that way, we're also organizing as a campaign along with CURB to push for the demand that was highlighted recently by the California legislature's final version of the 2026-2027 state budget, in which they agreed with us that one additional prison ought to be closed in the coming year. A little bit further north, our Critical Resistance Portland chapter was running what they called a mini campaign in the last year. That was a localized budget fight in Portland, aiming to reduce a proposed increase to the police budget by the city, highlighting that the city of Portland is and has been in a deep budget deficit, and that there are things that the community needs more than more police. So they were able to successfully reduce that proposed increase to the police budget by $2 million. They worked in coalition with Unite Oregon and other movement partners, and we're really working to disrupt the narrative that we have spoken about here a little bit already, the narrative that policing keeps us safe. And they pressured the city to invest in things like parks, childcare, food access, and housing. And the $2 million that was diverted away from policing was actually put towards affordable after-school and summer childcare programs in the Portland parks. So that was a great win for our Portland chapter that happened just recently, and now they're gearing up to mobilize towards a new campaign that's going to be specifically working in coalition to protect the Portland Clean Energy Fund, which is another area of the budget that the Portland Police Bureau is eyeing for their own budget, to bloat their own budget. And last but certainly not least, our newest chapter, Critical Resistance Central Appalachia, is part of a coalition called Building Communities, Not Prisons, that has been organizing specifically around the proposed construction of a new federal prison in Letcher County, Kentucky. There's a great piece in our Ecological Justice of the Abolitionist newspaper, which we'll make sure to get into the show notes, that goes into depth about this campaign, because this campaign is specifically bringing together goals of the ecological justice movement with the prison industrial complex abolition movement to defend very fragile environmental sites that have been slated for construction for this federal prison project. One huge win from that campaign in the last couple of years was that a small parcel of the land that is slated for that prison construction was actually purchased right out from under the Bureau of Prisons and rematriated to an Indigenous land stewardship organization who are going to focus on environmental justice, Indigenous land cultivation practices, instead of continuing the toxic construction of the proposed prison site in Letcher County.
Thank you so much, Abby, for taking us on that really tour around the country of all the victories that your chapters are, really moving forward. That's so, I mean, so many of these, I was just like, wow, that is huge. These are like systemic disruptions in the PIC. So that's incredible to hear about that work. And I would love to move us into a little bit of envisioning of the future, because I think, especially these days, but really just in late stage capitalism, it's pretty easy to get trapped in like capitalist realism or not being able to envision a future that doesn't look like one that's infiltrated with incarceration and policing and detention, and imagination and creativity. Like you both were kind of speaking about, what does public safety involve? Like, what are the things that keep you safe? Our ability to imagine that is so powerful to resistance as well. So I just want to take us on like, hop in my little time travel cube here. Let's just say it's like 50 years from now. Imagine the abolitionist future that you're fighting for, that your chapters are fighting for. The PIC is dismantled, the changes have been made, what we need to build has been built. What does that look like in practice? If you were to paint us that picture, could you create a little bit of a visual as to what that looks like?
I love a good visioning moment. I might go on a slightly tangentially related journey, maybe like on my walk up to the time cube. I'll share a little bit of thoughts there and then head on into the cube and where we come out. Yeah, thinking about what an abolitionist future might look like in practice, as we envision what we want the future to look like, we take the steps to make it right now. And so that's a little bit of where the like dismantle, change, build comes from. In addition to the campaign work that Abby named, we have done and have seen across our movement people building up our capacities, building up our community connections and skills and tools to show up for each other, as opposed to relying on like cops and cages. So I just wanted to uplift some community projects where that prefigurative, as I'll call it, mindset has really shown up. Some places where that's shown up for us within CR is one example that comes to mind is the Oakland Power Project, which was a years-long initiative within Oakland, basically working to reject policing as the default response to harm by working with residents, organizations to highlight or make alternatives that really worked. And so thinking about a community garden came out of that, obviously, like providing food and community and connection and skills within the community. And on the other hand, there was also really, really beautiful healthcare emergency preparedness for non-life-threatening things coming up, as well as very intense, very acute emergencies coming up in Oakland community that they were naming at the time. And across those efforts, it brought together community members, healthcare workers, emergency response folks, and more to teach each other skills that they already had and wanted to bring more to light to be able to make it so that we can really take care of each other in these moments. I think we're seeing now some like abolitionist storefronts making it so like, okay, these stores are committing to not calling the cops if something happens, and like being able to really tap in with community. That reminds me of harm-free zones that I think the CR New York City chapter a few years ago was trying to start up by making it, again, like community hubs that, hey, we're all agreeing and building up the skills and materials to make it so that if something comes up, we can take care of it internally in ways that are not creating or perpetuating harm. So I just wanted to uplift some really sweet and tangible examples of the ways that we can and are building that abolitionist future right now. maybe just one last little, as I'm stepping into the time box, it touches on some of the learnings that you asked about earlier. Just what are the learnings coming out of abolition across these decades and, like you said, centuries of abolitionist organizing? We're seeing the need to, and like moves to, strengthen the entire movement ecosystem. That is a role that we try to play within CR because we know we are stronger as an entire movement when we're working together and finding those commonalities and shared points of work. And we know that the prison industrial complex has many fronts, so we should as well, in terms of our resistance to it. So thinking about how are we connecting with labor and economic justice, environmental justice, faith-based groups, gender liberation, housing justice, how are we keeping in mind all of those fronts? Because again, we all have a shared stake in making it so that we have the resources we need to thrive in our communities and not a bunch of resources going to cages and cops that are actively working against that. So keeping in mind those different fronts, keeping in mind how are we working across geography, because every community is different, every community's needs are different, and all of the issues that our communities are facing look a little bit different. There's so much commonality, of course, but there are particulars given where we are. Really thinking internationally as well, really wanting to connect not just cross geography within this country, but with movements in the global south as well. We know we are in the imperial core, so we have a very strong duty to make it so that we dismantle these systems, not just here, but abroad as well, because the PICs and, of course, other mechanisms of racial capitalism are constantly being exported, fine-tuned, brought back here, all of those things. So we have to be thinking across border as well. And lastly, not building up what we're going to have to tear down later, making sure that we get there in really solid ways that don't make our lives harder in the interim. So with all of those considerations, but also all of those experiments and things that so many communities, movement organizations, local formations have been trying out for quite some time across decades, and like sharing materials and learnings from that. Now stepping into the time travel box, what comes out on the other end? That a little bit depends on all of us. I would say it's similar to that question of like, what makes you feel safe? Is under conditions where all of us as collectives, as communities, as individuals have what we need to thrive on a daily basis. What does that look like to you? And I would imagine there's a little bit of a one-to-one correlation, like access to stable housing, access to healthcare. So think about like, okay, on the other side of this, everyone is housed and no one is getting swept up by the state for being outside for too long. Everyone has really stable and accessible healthcare, so they're getting their physical and mental and behavioral needs met. Everyone is fed, like lots of beautiful community gardens, lots of play, lots of joy, lots of vibrancy. I'm imagining, and maybe like this is just me, but I'm imagining it looks somewhat like that on, I would say, levels that are hard to even scale up in our minds. But I think community by community, ideally that vibrancy and actual health and stability and security is there. Yeah. And I wonder, like, what comes up for both of you too? What is on the other end of when you come out of this this time travel box?
Well, I mean, I really, what you're sharing surely really resonates. I think it also looks like the way that we address harm and make repair looks drastically different than how we do today. And what I mean by that is more leaning on transformative justice and ways that we are holding each other accountable, which also means being honest with each other and giving each other feedback and engaging in conflict and doing stuff that feels really uncomfortable, doing stuff that I personally want to avoid, but try to engage in because it's part of building the future we want to see. So that's one that really stands out for me. And I think it's also a world where we get to put our energy towards the things that give us meaning and purpose, and not just towards the things that we need to survive or, extract labor from ourselves to do that. And where there's more time for art and culture. And that we feel capable of a community actually, to your point, Shirley, actually keeping us safe, that we can actually rely on each other, which means there's like real trust with people that are not the same as us, or maybe have somewhat different values, or look different than us, or think differently than us. And that goes back to the conflict. But those are some things that come up for me. What about you, Abby?
That's resonating with me a lot, Jordan. I think partially because prior to coming to work at CR, I was employed at a restorative justice diversion organization in the Bay Area for a long time, which is to say that those things are happening in small ways. And it's sticky always of how do you create an abolitionist microcosm under the current system that we already live under, right? How do you create that under fascism? How do you create that under a complete prison industrial complex, under racial capitalism? And that's something that's so motivating about the abolitionist future idea and the imagination and the visioning, that once that ball kind of starts rolling, the thread starts to unravel. You see how many of these oppressive forces are really interconnected and standing between us and the abolitionist future that we need to and want to build for ourselves. So there's so many interconnected systems that need to fall in order to make this abolitionist future possible in a deep, true way. Part of that goes back to what Shirley was saying about all the different facets of movement that have to be strengthened in order for that to be possible, in order for us to all push forward together. And we need to be thinking about the intersections of prison industrial complex abolition with labor, environmental, health, all those things that Shirley was mentioning. And I think in addition, we do really need to grapple with the understanding of how are we going to address harm as abolitionists? Because harm happens. People are imperfect. People harm each other. People always have, and people always will, to varying degrees. And if we're committed to being in community with each other, and we're committed to really pushing this future forward together, we need to commit to being uncomfortable sometimes and having those hard conversations sometimes, and not treating each other as if we're disposable, right? Because that's what the prison industrial complex does. It disappears people who cause harm, and it pushes them to the outskirts of a society so that they don't have to be dealt with in that meaningful way. One of the central terms of restorative transformative justice is talking about accountability. There's none of that exists in the prison industrial complex. There's punishment, there's retribution, but accountability in a real way is not something that's a stated goal of the prison industrial complex or of our legal processes that we currently have for addressing harm. So that's something we really have to grapple with and contend with. We can't pretend that harm doesn't happen or will never happen, because that's just not realistic. But what we don't have to do is to continue to perpetuate and cause more harm by pushing people through the prison industrial complex, and continuing to commit to that destruction of individuals, of communities, of entire ecosystems, in order to say that we're addressing the harm.
One last thing. I'm glad that you brought us here too, Jordan, because a question we so frequently get is like, oh, well then if there are no cops, no cages, then what about when harm happens? And I think something that we as abolitionists have been sharing, and I think it's been understood more and more lately, but we take harm very seriously. Like, it's not a glib thing that we try to gloss over and pretend that doesn't happen. Like, we understand that it does, and we believe in tending to that in really holistic ways that center people, center experience, and like Abby said, are not treating people as disposable. And I think it's an interesting exercise to help people think about, like, okay, what are we talking about when we say harm to? Because we are seeing people not get their needs met and being either disabled or dying from preventable medical treatments just not happening because we don't have solid health care. So is that not harm? Is it not harm if people don't have shelter? Is it not harm if people don't have access to stable and wholesome food and water? Do we want to count those things as harm? Because one, yes, we should. And two, like, okay, how are we reckoning with those things? And I think that's a vantage point that we do and should hold more as abolitionists as well. The inherent harms of living under these global systems of racial capitalism. Just wanting to name some of those things, and how can we work together to make it so that, of course, interpersonal harm is tended to with lots of real care and intention and accountability, and to resist these very intense and massive systems of harm that are making it so that on a very day-to-day basis, we can't get our needs met. How are we working together across movement, across sector, across geography to get ourselves out of those really intense, destructive global systems of harm?
That was so well said, Shirley. And it brought to mind for me, like, the definitional power around what harm is so incredibly important. And that's, again, coming back to the idea of having to change common sense, not only around safety, but around harm. I think of another example that comes to mind for me a lot, which is wage theft, which is a huge, pervasive harm that touches so many working class people and holds down so many working class people and is never treated like a harm in the eyes of our criminal legal system. So how can we elevate that to a harm that we take as seriously as it should be taken seriously? Because that's a harm that touches so many people and holds so many people down.
Yes. And like billionaires not paying taxes. Oh, thank you both. Wow, that got so juicy. And sometimes I remember I was like talking to someone in the car about abolition, and they were like, well, does that just mean like there would be no war? Like, I can't even imagine that happening. And I'm like, okay, let's just like back up and maybe start with like the most common reason people are being incarcerated, or like, well, what about like there's just like all these like one-off examples, and it's like, well, one, does incarceration even address that? But that aside, again, like that is not the main reason people are being incarcerated to even begin with. And if we actually invest in a society that actually does keep us safe, that actually does let us thrive, a lot of these ramifications that lead to violence and harm, like you're mentioning, doesn't really need to exist. It's not really a thing that happens following on from those conditions. So just really appreciate you both like touching on that and like lifting up so many examples. I'm going to move us into the wrap up. And with that, I'll just make space for, if I could wave a magic wand, what's like one thing you want listeners to know or do after listening to this episode?
I'll start us off and say, go to our website, criticalresistance.org. Take a gander at some of the resources we have. Sign up for our email updates, because that is one surefire way to receive lots of regular analysis on current affairs with an abolitionist lens, and to get updates on our campaigns and projects across all of our chapters and elsewhere. Abby mentioned the Abolitionist newspaper a little bit earlier. Subscribing to that is a really great way to, again, get our abolitionist analysis, as well as lots of movement partner contributions. We have lots of imprisoned writers contribute as well, and through that publication that's released 2 times a year, we cover a range of topics, so from ecological justice, gender justice, housing justice, and more. You can learn a lot more about intersecting struggles there. Our next issue is actually going to be out by the time this episode airs. It will be issue 45 of the newspaper on keeping our movements alive. It is a very vibrant issue, very beautiful issue, pulling together a lot of really great writing, analysis, and tools, and things that I think people really need in this moment, where things, of course, seem bleak. Do not give in to despair. Let radical hope move you forward. We have a duty, we have a calling. And this is just one way that can hopefully reignite the fire in you to fight and contribute to freedom fights everywhere. One other thing I will name is, as we mentioned toward the beginning, we still exist under these conditions of racial capitalism, thereby meaning we need resources to do our work. Critical Resistance really appreciates funding from individuals as well as institutions for individuals looking to sustain our organizing. We have a plethora of ways to give. You can give to us online or by check or through donor-advised funds or through proceeds from stock donations and a lot of other ways as well, like workplace donations. So we will share those methods with you shortly. And maybe one last thing I will name, and then if we have any additions, we love to talk to people. So if you want to chop it up, learn more about our work, chat with us a little bit more one-on-one, we are always open and eager to do so. Would love to hear about your connections to anti-carceral organizing or PIC abolitionist organizing or other movements that you come from that you think could benefit from an abolitionist lens, or that you think abolition could benefit from utilizing other frameworks. So we will also share ways to connect with us a little bit more directly as well. But Abby, if there is anything that you wanted to add there.
I'll just add regarding our publication, the Abolitionist newspaper, like Shirley mentioned, published twice a year, both English and Spanish. It's a bilingual publication. And it's distributed with every publication to about 5,000 incarcerated subscribers across prisons, jails, and detention centers, absolutely for free. So if you are able to subscribe to The Abolitionist as a paid subscriber outside of prison walls, your subscription makes it possible to keep those subscriptions free for our folks inside. If you're a member of an institution like a library, a university, you can do an institution level subscription to get copies of The Abolitionist for your institution. And if you're an individual, then there are different tiers of subscription. So you can pay according to your ability in order to sustain the Abolitionist newspaper, one of the oldest projects of critical resistance. In addition, if you're located near a chapter city, come and connect with your chapter. We've got contact information for all of our chapters available on our website. Some of our chapters, including Portland and Los Angeles, have their own social media. You can connect with them on Instagram. And I'm sure that all of our chapters would love to see you come out to volunteer with our prisoner correspondence program. We also have books available for purchase on our website. If you're looking for juicy abolitionist texts to dig into, like Our Prison's Obsolete by Angela Davis, Golden Gulag by Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, two of our fantastic, wonderful co-founders, we encourage you to check out our website or your local library to check out some of those titles and more. And I think that's probably enough. We've probably overwhelmed the people, but we hope to be able to connect with folks. We're always looking for more connections in whatever movement space you're in. If you're not in a movement space, it's not too late to get yourself organized. And we hope to see folks out there organizing for the abolitionist future that we must build together.
What you said, Shirley, like it's up to us is really like landing with me as we close out, and let that be a choose your own adventure from what Abby and Shirley just shared. And really, yeah, just thinking about what are the ways that we can support and invest in the change that we want to see. How does it connect to our money story? Where are there opportunities to dig into resources or even read something with your family that Critical Resistance has published? So many ways to invite people into this work. So just a big gratitude, Shirley and Abby, for coming on here. Thank you so much for listening to the Reimagine Wealth podcast. You can find resources and links from today's episode in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode, please like, review, subscribe, and share this with those in your community. If you'd like to support the show, you can become a paid member of my Substack, which allows me to sustain this work and have more episodes to share in the future. Again, links to all of that and more are in the show notes. And until next time, I'm sending you resilience and warmth, and thank you so much for tuning in.